Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. The PM's glass jaw was on full display today, getting hostile as the fallout from the domestic violence valley continued again. Now, you won't believe his response when asked a pretty reasonable question about who said what. A story that frankly isn't getting enough attention. That's the new pandemic treaty that the World Health Organization wants Australia to sign up to. Now, if this gets ratified, we could see laws imposed in Australia that impact our sovereignty and make the recent COVID restrictions look tame. Are we raising a generation of zombies with kids hooked to their phones and social media? Well, that's the view of one respected 30-year teaching veteran who wants to see teachers take control back in the classroom. And emerging from witness protection, the embattled Home Affairs Minister Clare O'Neil popped up briefly on breakfast television as more revelations today amid claims the government has misled Australians.
The safest thing for the community is for that individual and others like him to be in immigration detention. And when I had the power to maintain that situation, I did. All of these people were detained.
Claire, for the last 6 months, you have come on this program and said if there is anything you could do, you would do it. Yet you did not oppose bail for this criminal.
But first, last night I said that the foreign criminal scandal could hardly get worse for the Albanese government, but today it has. Trying to fend off the blame for the savage bashing of a Perth woman, Annette Simons, allegedly by a freed foreign criminal, the government insisted yesterday, that it had opposed bail and had tried to keep this criminal behind bars. Here's the government minister, Michelle Rowland.
I am aware that this is now a police matter. Bail had been opposed.
Well, Rowland and other ministers yesterday ran those lines because that's what the talking points issued each day to frontbenchers told them. Bail was opposed for 2 visa breaches, said the leaked notes. But as Sky's Trudy McIntosh has revealed today, that wasn't the truth. In fact, when this former detainee fronted court for his visa breaches, the Albanese government did not oppose bail at all. It did not oppose bail. The Commonwealth let him go free. So despite 11 press secretaries in the PM's office on a combined cost to taxpayers of $2 million plus, they can't get something as important as this right. Or they deliberately hid the facts to try and mislead you. Now, whatever is the truth, I bet it's little comfort to the woman bashed and her family, especially as we learn that the magistrate said during this hearing that if the Commonwealth had opposed bail, she would not have granted it. Now, this just gets worse and worse for the Albanese government. We've also discovered that the man charged with a violent attack on Annette Simons wore his ankle bracelet to his hearing back in February, but even before he left the court, with those claims, of course, that he'd breached visa bail conditions and had been bailed, the ankle bracelet was subsequently removed sometime in March. The ankle bracelet was removed. The ankle bracelet that showed up the fact that he was breaching curfew, and then it was removed and he walks out the door. Now you can see, can't you, why this detention debacle is political poison for the Albanese government. Repeatedly incompetent, repeatedly deceptive, and with spiralling dreadful consequences for innocent Australians. The 2 ministers responsible, Giles and O'Neil, should have been sacked weeks ago. But as someone shrewdly observed to me today, the reason why they are still there is that at least they're taking the heat off the Prime Minister, because if they weren't, we'd all be blaming him, which sheet our anger home to Anthony Albanese. Well, if you look at Labor's slide in the polls, I think that's happening already anyway. Now, if you thought that businesses needing capital should go to a bank or finance house or find the resources from their own reserves, well, you'd be wrong, because now they just ask the Albanese government for more and more of your money. In March, there was $840 million for a rare earths mine and refinery in the Northern Territory, and then $230 million for a lithium project in Western Australia, all private companies. In April, there was $400 million for an alumina processing plant in Queensland, $185 million for a graphite project in South Australia, plus $1 billion to produce solar panels at the site of the old Liddell coal-fired power station. Again, all private commercial players. Yesterday too, as we reported, another $1 billion, this time to fund a US outfit to build a quantum computer in Queensland, another private entity. And today it's reported there'll be yet more billions in the upcoming federal budget to create a so-called green hydrogen industry. Now that's on top of the $2 billion, they called it the Hydrogen Head Start last year, in the budget. So I make the point, this is all borrowed money, given Australia is drowning in debt. $891 billion of debt to be exact, almost $1 trillion. $1 trillion or 1,000 billion. And don't forget, a billion is 1,000 million. See why we should care about the big numbers this government's addicted to throwing around? It's money you work hard to hand over in taxes. As Kerry Packer famously said in a parliamentary hearing, it's not as if the government spends it wisely, is it? And all this spending is to take us from being an affordable energy superpower, using our abundant coal and gas, and I wish we could, our uranium, none of which the government, of course, needs to subsidise, to being a country with unaffordable energy, relying on green schemes that we need to subsidise at every step of the way. It's all part of the government's future Made in Australia policy. Meanwhile, the things we actually do make, like plastics, we soon won't make any more because the Chinese owners of Qenos, that's our biggest plastics manufacturer, well, they're shutting it down, citing the high price of gas. So instead of making plastics here, which without a modern economy can't operate, we'll soon be importing our plastics from China. Now, if the government has money to throw at business, and it's far from clear that it should, why not throw it at the businesses that are actually operating here, employing Australians, and making the things we actually need? Now, this is all so wrong-headed, it's hard to know where to begin. Any government that starts to subsidise businesses without a clear plan and an overriding national goal, such as the creation of an armaments industry, as an example, well, it's on the road to economic perdition. In this case, it's all about net zero. And that's an utterly self-destructive path for 3 reasons. First, because once a government starts handouts, businesses have no reason to be efficient and competitive. They know they can always go back to the government for more because the government can't afford them to fail. Today, the Clean Energy Council said that the investment or subsidies required for green hydrogen would have to be in the double-digit billions. Now, the second other point is because once government starts picking winners, cronies will always get in the act, pulling strings and calling in favours, as suggested by reports today that there's links between a quantum computer company selected yesterday and various former Labor staffers, now turned lobbyists. And third, because none of this green technology is proven, at least at scale. Now, this is the most green left government in Australia's history, and its legacy will be a whole lot of expensive green junk that's unlikely ever to work well. All the while, the energy we do have in abundance gets shut down and costs and unreliability continue to skyrocket. All right, Cam Renner now with the headlines.
It's a crisis that has the nation and the Prime Minister saying enough.
Too many children are going up without their mums because of their murder.
At a virtual meeting of National Cabinet, state leaders have endorsed a $925 million boost from the Commonwealth to fund payments for women escaping abusive relationships. So-called revenge porn is already illegal. Now the government will outlaw deepfake pornography, created using AI and often graphic in content.
We will work with the government on whatever basis is required to bring an end to this violence.
A new phase of anti-domestic violence ads will be rolled out too, while content classification rules will be reviewed and there'll be a trial of age verification for online pornography. Sky News has revealed the Commonwealth did not oppose bail for an immigration detainee accused of breaching his curfew, despite claiming that it did. Trudy McIntosh broke the story.
Yesterday, government sources who know about this intimately, were repeatedly telling the media, myself included, that the Commonwealth had opposed bail when this went before court. They were wrong. This information, as I'll show you here, was included in the daily talking points. That's what's sent around to every member of the government. Bail was opposed for 2 visa breaches. It can't get much more explicit than that. Michelle Rowland on Sky News yesterday morning repeating that wrong information.
I am aware that this is now a police matter. Bail had been opposed.
A case of not checking, it seems, given this report in the West Australian newspaper from the day of this bail hearing. It says the magistrate told the man he was on, quote, very thin ice, adding that she would not have granted bail had the Commonwealth not been so generous.
A combination of burnout, harassment and health issues triggered Nicole Flint's abrupt departure from politics. At the next election, the former Liberal MP will seek to win back her old seat of Boothby in South Australia.
I'm running again because my health is on track, but the nation isn't.
Well, for more on all that, I'm joined now by Sky News host, National Affairs Editor for The Telegraph, James Morrow, and Cam Reddit, who brought you that package. Gents, great to see you both. Let's start with this foreign criminal bungle. I mean, every day it goes from bad to worse. We just saw a terrific analysis there from our colleague Trudy McIntosh. She exposed the fact that the Commonwealth did not oppose bail for this Kuwaiti-born detainee. They said they did. They claimed they did yesterday. It was there in the talking points that get sent out to all politicians. But in fact, he's already been released on bail 3 times this year, and he's now charged, of course, over the violent home invasion and the bashing of their Perth grandmother, Nanette Simons. We also know, we discussed this last night, it was suggested by Dan Tehan. There's plenty of evidence out there today that he was no longer wearing an ankle bracelet. Now, this is very interesting. James, any way you cut this is a disaster for the government. We haven't seen much of these 2 ministers. I mean, he was saying, the PM today, oh, well, Claire O'Neill was out there. Well, only because she's got a regular spot on Breakfast TV, and she was absolutely beat up, not just by Jane Hume there from the opposition, but by the host. She was completely strident and under pressure. I mean, this is a shocking look for the national government.
Well, you know, Peter, it's not just a shocking look for the national government, it's shocking for Australia. You know, we have 149 detainees out there who were released as a result of this High Court decision. Now, let's also, we talk about Claire O'Neill, we talk about Andrew Giles and all this. Let's also not forget that Mark Dreyfus signed off on letting the Human Rights Commission put in their own brief in favour of the plaintiff, NZYQ, that led to this whole debacle in the first place. So, you know, there's very little ministerial responsibility here. I think it's shocking to see Claire O'Neill keep retreating to the same talking point as, well, oh, it's just a shame to see Peter Dutton being so negative about this. Well, you know, you've had this elderly couple allegedly bashed in their own home brutally in a violent home invasion, and you know, they're saying, oh, well, the real problem here is Peter Dutton. I don't think people are buying it, and it shows that they're very weak on this issue, and the real problem, of course, is that Labor is just genuinely weak on borders. It's not in their DNA, Peter, to be tough on this stuff.
Yeah, just to underscore that point you're making there, that the only response from the minister, rather than take responsibility herself, she's been in the portfolio now for 2 years, is to claim Peter Dutton's being negative. I don't know how you can be positive about someone being bashed within an inch of their life, but that's her line. Let's have a listen to her on Breakfast TV this morning.
Will you resign?
I think it was a bit disappointing yesterday to see the opposition immediately out playing the politics on this matter. The opposition has had, their time playing a lot of politics with this, playing the politics within an inch of its life. I have not heard them make a single suggestion of something that could have been done differently. And if they would like to do it, I'm all ears.
I just have to say I've been in politics a long time. That is schoolgirl politics, right? That is university politics. She needs to grow up and accept responsibility for what's happening on her watch. I'm ashamed. I want to see good, strong women in politics, left or right, but I'm ashamed by that. Let's go to that National Cabinet meeting today. They all fronted up, of course, very important issues about domestic violence, Cam. Two announceables, $5,000 to support women who are fleeing a domestic violence situation, and then some broader bans in relation to the sharing of AI-altered intimate photographs. We call this revenge porn. Now, fair enough, I think they're both pretty worthy, but the biggest issue is bail reform. Absolutely the biggest issue facing this country. Yes, it's in great part it's a state issue, but all the premiers were around the table and they completely dodged that issue. That's a big deal.
Yeah, and this is the sort of thing where those in the criminology space, those in the front line who are dealing with victims and people and families that are affected by domestic violence or family violence say will make the biggest difference. Something where, for example, if there's even a whiff of that kind of intent for an alleged offender, that they would not get bail, particularly those in the criminology space, say this is the kind of reform that is needed. We know that bail laws were discussed around the table today, although no announcements. We'll be looking ahead to this meeting of the police ministers on Friday, where ministers from across the nation, different states, will be discussing things like bail law reform, things like, for example, closer monitoring as well on those who they believe are at high risk of reoffending. But you're right, Peter, this is the sort of thing where advocates, where those in this space believe there needs to be reform. We've talked about, or we heard today, something of a theme, if you like, from this National Cabinet was the search for a best practice, of a gold standard where you would have uniformity and responses that take the best of every state, come up with a gold standard and are then rolled out across the nation. How long that will take to get there, we don't know. And that really is the golden question. So the focus today very much on extending this existing program, making it permanent for those trying to flee violent situations, and of course a crackdown on online, which is a bit more of a generational thing, trying to prevent young children growing up and then becoming violent or being affected by that kind of content. But in terms of immediate reform, much of which, as you point out, will require state legislation, that remains in the formative stage. And when that might become a reality remains to be seen.
Months and months and months and months. I tell you, they could have done more today. It's very, very disappointing. And, you know, Andrew Clennell was there at the press conference. He put the Prime Minister under some pressure about the bail reform issue. But then he followed up with this question in relation to the PM's appearance at the domestic violence rally over the weekend.
You've said, have a look at the tape, everyone can see what was said. Well, what was said was, do you want me to speak or not? I'm the Prime Minister. Could you have handled that interaction a bit better in retrospect?
Oh, look, it is. You've put that, you haven't put what was said beforehand. I think the video before then as well clearly indicates what the view was over whether that was appropriate or not.
What did that show? Excuse my ignorance.
You can look at it. You work at Sky.
Twice he had a crack at Sky News, James.
Yeah, no, I mean, it just shows the thin-skinned nature, I think, of Anthony Albanese under pressure, which we've seen plenty of times before here. You know, this is not the first time that he's taken exception to some piece of reporting or something that Sky does and called out Sky or a journalist. You know, he's called me out in question time before for writing things he didn't like. So, you know, this is just a very, it goes to the character. And I think that it is, you know, it shows that he's trying to do, I think, a repeat of the misogyny campaign that they ran against Scott Morrison in 2022. But I think that he has to be careful that he's not morphing into what he claims to be fighting against.
James, just before we go, she's a great man of yours. Of course, she's a good friend of mine. But a pretty gutsy call today from Nicole Flint confirming that she'll run again for her former very marginal seat of Boothby. This is in South Australia. She's clearly up for a fight.
Yeah, no, she is. I think it's great news, for her that she's getting back in the arena, that she's going to go and recontest Boothby, that suburban Adelaide seat south of Adelaide, in the next election. I think that's absolutely great. I think it's great for South Australia, and I think it's great for the coalition, for the Liberal Party, to have this such a strong performer. I mean, she is, as everybody knows, she's a great performer. We see her on Sky all the time, very smart across the issues. And I think, what we saw from her today was a real laser-like focus on cost of living and the real issues in the way that the Albanese government has led the country astray. And I think she's going to be a great asset, I think, for Peter Dutton's team going into the next election.
Cam, I updated people last night that the white flag has been flapped around by David Shiraz in that defamation action brought on by Linda Reynolds. But also there's a bit of an update too, isn't there, in relation to Bruce Lerman and whether he might appeal that civil judgment.
He's been given a bit more time to decide whether he's going to appeal, Peter, until the 27th of May, which is a little longer than he was originally given. And as a result, this hearing, which was set for today, due to decide essentially who pays for everything now that the dust is settled. He's lost that defamation case against Network 10. A final decision has been reserved by the Justice, which means essentially it'll go back to court at a later date at which he'll decide when Bruce Lerman or Channel 10, if they have to foot some of the bill as well, will pay for everything, in particular legal fees. We know Bruce Lerman has already agreed to pay a bit over $4,500 to Peter Fitzsimons, for example, for the recovery of documents that were produced as a part of that trial. There are question marks, Peter, about practically how much Bruce Lerman will actually be able to pay, whatever that decision is, given the current state of his finances. Has been unemployed for some time, and question marks about how, if at all, he'll be able to foot the legal fees, let alone of himself, but of Network 10 if he's indeed ordered to do so.
All right, we'll watch that closely. Thank you, gentlemen. See you both next week. Now, I want to return to the concerns that are mounting in the community when it comes to the Islamist terror threat. We're learning more and more each day about the juveniles arrested last week on terror charges, including today that a 17-year-old boy alleged to be in possession of extremist propaganda has in fact been granted bail. Joining me now, foreign editor for The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Well, Greg, I've said it multiple times. You wrote about it very powerfully yesterday in The Australian. Our authorities have got to be honest when discussing the Islamist threat, don't they?
Oh, absolutely, Peter. And I'd pay a compliment to you. I saw one of your programs last week. One of your panel called it Islamic terrorism, and you said, no, it's better to call it Islamist terrorism. That's what it is. Islamism is the ideology that Islam, a very conservative interpretation of Islam, should rule all state government matters, and the terrorists use force to impose their Islamist ideology. I'm a great fan of Mike Burgess, the head of ASIO, but in 2021, in a concession to Islamic community leaders, he said, OK, I will no longer use the term Islamist terrorism because they don't want me to use any term that, derives from the word Islam. I'll call it violent religious extremism. Now the Islamic community leaders are demanding that the government stop using the words violent religious extremism because it has nothing to do with religion. So appeasing minority group leaders who are making unreasonable demands to be treated differently from everyone else doesn't lead to any lasting settlement. The truth is, it is Islamist terror. Islamic leaders need to call it out and denounce it the minute it happens, just like, you or I would if there was a Catholic terrorist outbreak or something like that. And, it's just wrong to not use the correct term. And, of course, the current government is the most cowardly of all. Although I think, the last Prime Minister to use the correct term actually was Malcolm Turnbull, who used the term Islamist terror.
Let's go to this whole debacle regarding the detainees, the foreign detainees out in the community. Immigration Minister Andrew Giles, he was digging in today. He's not fronting the media, but he's certainly putting out the statements via reporters appearing in print that he's not returning, he's not going to go anywhere, he's not going to resign. But just into the studio now, moments ago, that Perth grandmother who was allegedly attacked by that detainee, well, she has spoken out. Have a listen.
I don't feel very safe here anymore, unfortunately. I don't. But I'm doing my best to live here. I don't know. Why was his ankle bracelet removed in March? He should be safe, but, you know, we feel we've been let down.
So you tell me, you've been around a long time, how does Giles keep his job here? How does O'Neill keep her job?
Well, Peter, you know, I must say I have some respect for O'Neill, but I've never seen a performance as bad as Andrew Giles in 45 years of professional journalism. A lot of the ministers in the Albanese government, apart from Jim Chalmers and Penny Wong, they never seem to be on top of the basic facts in their portfolio. All those days in Parliament when they asked Giles basic questions like how many people are subject to ankle bracelets, how many people are subject to detention orders, and he either couldn't or wouldn't say. And if he wouldn't say, that's disgraceful because they promised to be transparent. But quite often you get the sense with him that he can't say because he's just not really across the details. How can he not tell us how many people are subject to ankle bracelets? Now, they rushed these mechanisms into Parliament with a screaming urgency, ankle bracelets and detection orders to keep everyone safe. And as recently as yesterday, they were saying they opposed bail for this guy. And everything they tell you just turns out to be, you know, to have at best an accidental relationship with the truth. Now, I've generally thought governments shouldn't sack ministers. I thought John Howard in his early days, he sacked too many ministers over trivial breaches of the ministerial code. But I now think Giles has become such a shocking symbol of the government's failure to take responsibility, its absolute inability to project any sense that it knows what it's doing or that it's in charge of anything. I don't think the government can just rely on the anonymity of Giles anymore. I think this is one of the worst ministerial performances I've ever seen in my life.
Just before we go, put your foreign affairs hat on here. Give us a sense of how you are observing what's happening at Columbia University. I think it's probably the most pronounced. The NYPD raided the university. The pro-Palestinian protesters, they're all digging in. They're likening themselves to the campus civil rights movement of the 1960s, but A, that's historically ignorant, and this protesting on campus is infecting universities around the world, including, sadly, here in Australia.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Peter. So I think they do bear some comparison to the anti-Vietnam protests of the 1960s, which were violent and sectarian, and which the last thing they cared about was the human rights of the Vietnamese, because as soon as the communists took over and the Americans were defeated, they never gave them another thought. Happy to support the Khmer Rouge in their genocide in Cambodia and all the rest. But this is sectarian, violent and anti-Semitic demonstrations. The universities have been utter models of cowardice. One of the biggest failures in our civilization at the moment is the complete collapse of morale and integrity at Western universities. Florida University has handled it well. Columbia has been terribly confused. It's good to see Columbia at last trying to restore order. It's not only that these folks are trespassing and committing property offences, they are intimidating people on the basis of their religion and ethnicity, namely Jewish Americans. It's a wave of anti-Semitism sweeping across universities of all places in the West. This is a bitter conflict, but now the authorities have to assert themselves. Otherwise, they're just saying, this is mob rule. You're just going back to the street fighting gangs of 1930s fascism if these gangs are allowed to run universities. And as you say, it's happening in Australia now too.
You're not wrong, Greg. We'll leave it there. Those live pictures there that we just showed you and at the bottom of your screen. Okay, after the break, why Australia could be set to hand over a large part of our sovereignty to the World Health Organization and why the federal government hopes you won't wake up before they do so. Plus, we're raising a generation of zombies. At least that's one respected teacher's view of mobile phones and social media. She reckons it's taking us backwards. We'll speak to her after the break. Welcome back. Still to come, the teacher calling out the damaging impact of social media on kids, likening Australian students now to zombies or drug addicts. But first to something that really isn't getting the attention it should. The World Health Organization is expected to finalise a new pandemic treaty, with talks underway until the 10th of May, so Friday next week. The problem is that if ratified, this treaty could see Australia subjected to rules that are dictated not by our own elected officials, but by UN health bureaucrats. Now, having spent 262 days, I remember every one of them, in locked down Melbourne, I know just how bad the draconian COVID rules were here. But trust me when I say that this new pandemic treaty could see even harsher measures ushered in and more of our freedoms denied. Joining me now is someone who shares these concerns, LNP Senator for Queensland, Matt Canavan. Well, Matt, as I say, few people are talking about the scope of this treaty. Help us understand, for my viewers, what this is all about.
Well, what happened here, Peter, is in late 2021, a number of countries recommended that the treaties that do govern public health responses to pandemics be updated and refreshed. In their words at the time, they wanted a legally binding agreement on members to respond to the pandemic. You'll remember in late 2021, we're at the height, really, of the COVID craziness. You were probably still in lockdown. And despite all the public health advice before COVID stating that lockdowns were useless in response to respiratory viruses, that's where we ended up afterwards. And we've never had a good explanation about why the public health advice was junked during this crisis. Now, with this process that's been set in train, we're effectively looking at giving the body that discredited itself perhaps more than any other apart from the Chinese CCP during this crisis, the WHO. We're going to give the WHO more power. The WHO pretty much got everything wrong about the pandemic. They got the lockdowns wrong that I mentioned earlier, but keep in mind they'd also recommended against us closing our international borders. They wanted us to keep taking flights from Wuhan in late January 2020. Fortunately, the Morrison government ignored that advice and closed our borders regardless. But why would we give this discredited body? It's conflicted given how much money it takes from China. Why would we give it more power? That's what's on the cards here. Now, the latest draft that has come out in the last couple of months has been watered down a little bit from the one that came out earlier, so that's a positive step. But this draft would still give the WHO powers to provide advice on these matters. It would still require signatories to impose laws on misinformation in their own countries. And we've seen how damaging that can be in the last couple of weeks. We shouldn't be handing over more of our rights to international bodies. Our rights should be protected by our constitution and our laws, not subcontracted to international bodies, especially as discredited as the WHO is.
I just want to underscore a point you've just made there, Matt, about us junking our own pandemic plan. We had only in Australia updated our pandemic plan in August 2019, and then COVID hits. We throw away the plan. The plan did not recommend lockdowns. You're absolutely right. I researched all of this. I wrote about it in The Australian a couple of weeks ago. We junked our plans and we basically went into panic mode. We threw freedom out the window. We threw billions of dollars at a problem of our own making, and we weren't steady in our response. And the whole reason we had a pandemic plan that went way back to the era of bird flu, and we updated it regularly, was so that in a time of crisis, we'd have cool heads. Now, we don't even know, we haven't had a proper inquiry. We don't even know what we got right and what we got wrong, but we look like we're going to hand over a whole lot of power here to the UN. Now, the critics of people like you and me raising an alarm about this will say, treaties aren't binding in Australia necessarily, but you and I both know our courts take them very seriously, don't they?
Well, they have been used as a sword, if you like, to cut down the rights of state governments, to cut down the rights of local communities in our own country. So what signing a treaty does is activate part of our Australian Constitution, which gives the federal government the power to implement the provisions of a treaty. And so once that's activated, the federal government will be able to have the power, if we ratify this treaty, to, as I say, clamp down on misinformation. And going back to your excellent column you wrote in The Australian a few weeks ago, you made this point about how we junked all the science beforehand and ended up in a position where it wasn't just that we junked that science, we ended up in a position that anybody who sought to defend the credibility of, say, not imposing widespread lockdowns for long periods of time was denigrated a fool and a conspiracy theorist. And there was no debate allowed, if you remembered at the time. That kind of panicked environment is not one we should institutionalise with laws that effectively ban free speech and criticism of bodies like the WHO. I mean, who are they to tell us that they shouldn't be criticised? I mean, the WHO, as late as February 2020, put out a tweet saying that the coronavirus could not be spread from human to human transmission. I mean, there's never been the proper accountability here of what the WHO got wrong, how they got it wrong, nor the accountability of governments, including our own state and federal governments, of what they got wrong. And until we have a proper Royal Commission, we certainly shouldn't be signing up to a treaty like this that would potentially make things a hell of a lot worse if another pandemic came.
And how much they're funded from China and the pharmaceutical companies and all the other stuff. I mean, it's pretty muddy. Matt, we're going to rely on you to keep them honest as this negotiation keeps going and to flag things, because most of the media don't want to know about it. Thank you for your time. All right, just before we move off this discussion of pandemic rules, news out today from Victoria that all prospect of charges against those who ran hotel quarantine in Victoria connected to over 800 deaths. You'll remember that was found by the Coat Inquiry. Well, they have now today been dropped, meaning for all the families that lost their loved ones, there will be no prospect of justice. But now to the steady realisation that many of us are having regarding the harm that the internet, smartphones and social media in particular is having within our society and amongst our children especially. And it's got teachers and education experts pretty worried about future generations, with some even calling kids today Generation Zombie as a result. Now, for centuries, humanity has been educated using language, reading, the written word, and that's all been eclipsed now by picture-driven imagery on social media and the dopamine hit that delivers, meaning it means that young people favour pictures and their phones over the hard learning of books, words and numbers. The situation's become so bad that experts are calling for a complete ban on phones in schools across the country. Joining me now is Jean Yates, a teacher from Queensland with more than 30 years of experience, is quite outspoken on this issue. Jean, I really pay tribute to you for having the conversation. I think we're having it home around the kitchen table, but I don't think we're having enough in the public domain. What have you seen firsthand in relation to social media, smartphones and young people today?
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. It really is having an impact on them. So they're coming to school, I always say they're tired or wired. So they're either exhausted because they've been up all night on social media, or they're overstimulated because, you know, they're looking at this constant stimulation on their phone, this constant supply of whatever it is that they want to watch. So their attention spans have completely dropped and they just expect to be entertained all the time, you know, so they don't have the capacity to amuse themselves. They can't ever cope with being bored, and they're certainly not going to tune into anything that they don't find interesting.
One of the really interesting things I read that all of these tech billionaires in the Silicon Valley, they ban their own kids from devices and social media. Now, doesn't that tell you everything?
Yeah, although I do think we need to be really careful. I don't actually think that banning is the way to go. I think we need to model social media use a little better. And, you know, I don't think there are very many adults out there who wouldn't have to admit that we're all on our phones a bit too much. But I think rather than just banning the phones, banning the social media, we need to support kids to learn how to use them properly, how to develop that digital etiquette, if you like, because at some point they have to have the internal responsibility to decide when it's appropriate to be on devices and when it's not. And also, if we ban them and then the kids are exposed to something threatening online, they're not going to be prepared to seek help because they're going to be afraid that they're going to be in trouble. So we actually need to know what our kids are looking at, keep the lines of dialogue open and talk to them about the things that they might be seeing online.
You and I, Jean, though, we can remember a time when you went out for dinner and you weren't sitting on your devices. I mean, I often go out for dinner and I look around restaurants and see mum and dad on devices, kids on devices. I see couples out for a hot date and they're both on devices. I mean, it's just crazy, right? So we can remember life before devices. I know myself, I use my phone for work constantly. I feel sometimes You know, I can't watch TV without also looking at my device, and I say, that's enough. Put it away, put it in a drawer, put it away. But if you're growing up and all you know is life with a device, how do you moderate it?
It's like anything. Anything that you do obsessively is going to be dangerous for you. So, you know, every generation has had this problem. We all were worried about the printing press destroying society and about movies destroying society and so on. So every generation has had this challenge. It's just that we have to learn to moderate it, and it needs to be internally moderated as well as externally moderated. And, you know, as I said, adults need to model that there are times that phones need to be put away. I think it's probably why we're all feeling particularly stressed and particularly tired, because we don't have a distinction now between work time and socialising because we're on the same devices all the time.
Jen Yates, keep up the debate. Great to have you on the program. I've got a family member. You go around to his house and everyone, mum, dad, visitors, everyone, the devices go in a basket on the fridge. You're not allowed to touch them while you're in the house. You're going to have a conversation. Isn't that nice? Right, still to come, I regard him as a bit of a fake Liberal. Matt Keane. Well, he's upset about a bailout for the giant Eraring power station. Now, it's a worry when Labor's talking sense on energy and Liberals are not. Plus, even Chris Bowen's seen the light when it comes to Australia needing more gas. The problem is he's demonised it for years, so who's going to be willing to invest? Welcome back, Kel Richards, a little later on, as always. But let's bring my panel now. Shadow Environment Minister Jonathan Duniam and Senior Fellow at the Menzies Research Centre, Nick Cater. Well, welcome, gentlemen. Nick, I'll start with you if I can. These reports, the New South Wales government's working on a deal with Origin Energy to keep Eraring, this is the coal-fired power station, it's about 25% of the power in New South Wales, it comes from it. They want to keep it open beyond its planned closure date of 2025. So they want it there for another 4 or 5 years, they say. It could cost as much as $150 million a year. But Matt Keane, the Liberal, says don't bail them out. Let's have a giant big battery. Yeah, please, you're kidding me, aren't you? I mean, a battery's not going to match 25% of New South Wales power if Eraring is shut down.
Matt Keane is off with the fairies, Peter. I mean, you just cannot do it with batteries. And right now, I just checked, it's a cool evening here in Sydney, and Eraring's pumping out about 2 gigawatts of very useful electricity. Without that, we'd have blackouts. That's the bottom line. And I don't know whether it's in some sort of fantasy land or whatever, but you cannot run the grid without baseload power. And at the moment, that comes from coal, about 65-70% of the electricity that we use here in New South Wales. So I don't know how he thinks he's going to change that in the space of a year.
And I mentioned him tonight to remind Liberals in New South Wales you do not want him back on the front bench as leader. All right, if I can go to you now, Senator. Chris Bowen, he has admitted finally, when you knew gas, he says, particularly because we've got this bridge left there when renewables are coming in and we still haven't got baseload backup, he's gone ahead and green-lit 6 new offshore wind projects in Gippsland. Well, Gippsland's in Victoria, and he hasn't remembered that Victoria's banned gas, right down to our gas cooktops, in fact. So how's he going to square this circle?
Well, if you've ever wondered what it looks like when a dog that's been chasing its tail finally catches it, this is it. It's madness. There's no cohesion between state and federal Labor. There's no cohesion between federal Labor last week and federal Labor this week. As you said earlier in your program, he spent the better part of the last couple of years demonising gas and how evil it is. But then reality hits and they need it to keep the lights on, to keep manufacturing going. I only have to look at one of the most incompetent politicians, I believe, in Australia, Lily D'Ambrosio, who took aim at Madeleine King, the Federal Resources Minister, over her support for gas and her comments on it to demonstrate the point you've made. He might say we need gas, having demonised it for so long, but there is no way he's going to be able to get anything past the hard left of the Labor Party anywhere in the country, and that is bad for all Australians.
I might add too, a lot of those offshore wind farms are foreign owned, subsidised by Poor old Australian taxpayers, profits head offshore. Nick, all this talk about billions more in the budget, this is the Treasurer today, to fast-track all of these private sector projects. Now, I think government does a shocking job of picking winners, rarely works well. And more questions today about the $1 billion handed over to Psi Quantum to build this quantum computer in Brisbane. We find out there's an involvement of lobbyists connected with Labor. This has a real stench about it.
Yeah, stinks to high heaven, Peter. And, you know, it's not even come under any recognisable or registered government program. It's just out of the blue. I think it's wrong. I think this government is going way off beam with some of the subsidies and assistance it's offering to businesses. You know, the fact is, if a business can't get that funding from the private funding from private finance, then there's probably something, almost certainly something very not right about that business plan that they're operating to. That's always the way it is, and I think this is dangerous. I think the investment in hydrogen is putting good money after bad. They've got to change direction on this. If they want to support business, you actually do it through basic things like lowering corporate tax rates and cheap electricity. That's how you support business, not with subsidies.
Senator Duniam, I think one of the best policies you had the last election was allowing people to get their own super to get into the housing market. But you did it too late, right? Way, way, way too late. There's a lot of talk today in the media that you're actually going to be pretty bold here, that you're going to allow people to access more of their super, and you're going to announce something pretty soon. Well, what can you tell us?
Well, it would be foolish of me to pre-announce anything that might be coming up by way of announcements by anyone on the front bench, including the leader. But certainly there was discussion today following on from the policy at the last election to enable people to access 50 grand of their super, their money, as you point out, and perhaps the idea of enabling people to use their entire super funds to purchase a property. Now, I think we should have a discussion about all options. Labor will rule that one out straight away because, as we know, the unions control the super funds and, of course, are the paymasters of the government, and they don't want that money going into the pockets of those who own it. So we'll have that conversation. It's worth having because we've got to deal with affordability, but we also do need to deal with availability. State and local governments need to address land release so we can actually bring more supply on, or else prices are never going to taper off and come down to make housing more affordable. So we've got to address both ends. Affordability now, but land release so we have availability into the future as well.
Nick, Senator Duniam, thank you both for your time. A very quick break. After the break, Kel Richards with Words Matter. Welcome back. Joining me as he does every Wednesday, Kel Richards. Well, this is one that I'm always going toe-to-toe, Kel, with the lawyers. This is the word alleged. And Nicholas has written in saying, why do journalists always use the word alleged? He says, you know, in the case of someone where we can see the battered victim, well, that's not an alleged bashing. Clearly the person was bashed. But the point there goes to not that the assault is alleged. It's not alleged, it happened. But I guess it's the use of alleged in relation to the person accused, given we believe, obviously, in the legal presumption of innocence. I guess that's the technical point, isn't it?
That's exactly right. And you've got it right. And unfortunately, a lot of journalists haven't. They make everything alleged. I mean, alleged came into English around about 1300 from a French source word, which means something not yet proven. And they were told by the lawyers, now you've got legal training, but they don't, most journalists don't have, and they're told by the lawyers, now you can't say anyone has committed a crime until a court's convicted them. Say alleged. But then they say the offence was alleged. No, it wasn't. That poor lady in Perth, the 72-year-old, wasn't allegedly bashed. She was bashed. The bashing happened. But we can't say the perpetrator is guilty until they've been convicted in court. They are the alleged perpetrator. So, yes, journalists get... I keep saying it's either, you know, a lazy mind or a lazy mouth that causes problems in language, and this is a lazy mind. They haven't thought through what the word means and, therefore, how it should be used.
I liken it to the use of apostrophes. You know, when people don't know where an apostrophe is, they pepper the sentence with apostrophes. Right. And then it's a bit like that. Multiple alleged.
Yes.
Islam and Islamist. Susan wants to know the difference. I mean, I always use Islamist in terms of the, the radical ideology that signs itself up to terrorism, to separate it from the religion Islam. They're related, but they're not the same.
That's right. Islam came into English 1600 thereabouts from an Arabic word meaning submission, and that's the name for the religion. And Islamic is the standard adjectival version. Islamist is only used for the extremist version. Tony Abbott, I've been reading an article of his in Quadrant. He calls the Islamist the apocalyptic kill the infidels branch of Islam.
Cult.
So that's what it is. It's the extremist Wahhabist, Al-Qaeda version. Only that is Islamist. Everything else is Islamic. Everything else is Islam.
Just quickly, where can people go to send us more words for next week?
Okay, the website is ozwords, ozwords.com.au, ozwords.com.au. There's a contact page. Go to the contact page, type in your question. You'll get an answer from me, and we'll talk about it here.
That's it for us, Kel and I. Here is Andrew Bolt.